Germany, February 1945. The war is dying, but it isn't over. A layer of gray mist hangs low over a frozen airfield somewhere along the Rhine. Beneath it, rows of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs sit waiting, their canopies glazed with frost, engines cold. Mechanics hurry through the slush, unaware that death is already descending from the clouds. At 8,000 feet, a lone P-51 Mustang drops from the overcast, fast, low and silent until the very last second. Its pilot, a 22-year-old American farm boy from Oregon, grips the control stick with one hand and wipes condensation from his gun sight with the other. He's not supposed to be here. His squadron turned back 20 minutes ago. Orders were clear: conserve ammo, return to base. But orders mean little to him now. He rolls inverted and dives. The air screams past the canopy. At 400 miles an hour, the ground rises like a wall. He levels out inches above the treetops and opens fire. 8 Browning machine guns unleash thunder. In seconds, German planes erupt in fireballs. Flames crawl across the snow. Mechanics scatter for cover. By the time the smoke clears, 30 aircraft will lie shattered, and a farm boy will have done what doctrine said was impossible. By early 1944, the sky over Europe had become the deadliest battlefield in history. From dawn to dusk, the air was filled with the roar of engines, the crack of flak, and the endless hum of formations stretching from horizon to horizon. Every day, hundreds of American bombers, B-17s and B-24s, lifted off from the cold airfields of England. Their targets were the factories, refineries, and rail lines that kept Hitler's war machine alive. But to reach them, they had to fly straight into the heart of the Reich, through layers of flak, and into swarms of German fighters waiting in ambush. The bombers moved in tight boxes, believing safety lay in formation, but safety was an illusion. German interceptors, the sleek Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the rugged Focke-Wulf 190, struck from above and behind, their cannons shredding the slow-moving bombers before escorts could react. Entire squadrons vanished in minutes. By the summer of 1943, the U.S. 8th Air Force had lost so many crews that daylight bombing itself hung in doubt. Missions like Schweinfurt and Regensburg were slaughterhouses in the sky. 60 bombers lost in one day, hundreds of men gone. Survivors came back with shattered nerves, bullet-riddled planes, and the grim certainty that tomorrow would be worse. The problem wasn't courage. It was range, the P-47 Thunderbolt and P-38 Lightning. America's best fighters could only escort the bombers partway across Europe. When they turned back over Belgium or Holland, the bombers were left exposed, and the Luftwaffe pounced. For months, the Americans searched for a solution. It arrived almost by accident, a new, untested aircraft called the P-51 Mustang. Built by North American Aviation and fitted with the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the Mustang could fly faster, climb higher, and, crucially, go farther than any fighter before it. With drop tanks under its wings, it could escort bombers from England to Berlin and back. When the first Mustangs appeared over Germany in late 1943, the balance began to shift. The Luftwaffe's aces, men with hundreds of kills, suddenly found themselves hunted. The P-51s dove out of the sun, firing bursts from 6 synchronized Browning machine guns that tore through even the most maneuverable German fighters. For the first time, Allied pilots could take the fight deep into enemy territory and win. But victory came at a cost. The air war demanded everything from those who fought it. Pilots were barely in their 20s. Many had never seen combat before being thrown into the most unforgiving arena on Earth. They lived with death as routine, in the briefing room, at takeoff, and in the quiet moments before sleep. They smoked too much, joked too loudly, and never learned the names of new arrivals. The average life expectancy of a bomber crewman was 15 missions. For a fighter pilot, it wasn't much higher. Out of this crucible came a new kind of warrior, young men who combined skill with an almost reckless daring. They had no patience for hesitation. They trusted instinct more than procedure. Among them were farm boys, factory workers, and mechanics who'd grown up fixing engines and learning self-reliance the hard way. When they strapped into a Mustang, it felt familiar, like climbing onto a tractor that could fly at 400 miles an hour. Their discipline was improvisation. Their loyalty was to each other, not the rule book. And while generals wrote doctrine, these men rewrote it every time they took off. By 1945, the tide of war had turned. The Allies had taken back France, the Soviet Union was closing in from the east, and Hitler's Reich was collapsing. But the Luftwaffe still had bite. Scattered across Germany, dozens of airfields hid hundreds of fighters, silent, refueling, waiting for a chance to strike. The order from Allied High Command was clear: destroy them before they can fly. For most, that meant coordinated strikes, planned missions, ground reconnaissance, formation attacks. But for one pilot, a farm boy from Oregon who believed instinct could outthink command, it meant something else entirely. If the Germans were hiding their planes, he would hunt them where they slept, and he would do it alone. By late 1944, the war in Europe was burning itself out. But the air war was only growing more ferocious. Germany was cornered. The Allies owned the skies, yet they refused to stop hitting. Each day, waves of bombers crossed the Rhine, flattening cities, rail hubs, and oil refineries. Behind them came their escorts, the P-51 Mustangs, P-47 Thunderbolts, and P-38 Lightnings, thousands of them, sweeping deep into enemy airspace. The Luftwaffe, bled white by years of attrition, was dying fast. But it wasn't dead. Fuel shortages had grounded most of its training units, and replacement pilots were barely competent, yet desperation gave them fury. They launched last-ditch attacks from hidden dispersal fields carved into forests, striking bombers and convoys at low altitude. For every German aircraft shot down, another appeared. Not because the Reich could still build them, but because the remnants of its air force refused to quit. The Americans answered with a new form of warfare: fighter sweeps, independent roving patrols whose sole mission was to hunt and annihilate anything with wings, on the ground or in the air. These missions blurred the line between escort and assault, and they created men like Lieutenant Jack Howard. He wasn't a strategist or a tactician. He wasn't the product of West Point or Annapolis. He was the son of an Oregon farmer, a man who'd learned machinery by fixing plows and tractors, who understood the rhythm of engines like other men understood words. When he arrived in England, he was just another replacement pilot in the 354th Fighter Group, the unit that had first brought the P-51 to Europe. But once he flew it, something clicked. He didn't see an airplane. He saw an extension of himself. The Mustang was the perfect machine for his kind of instinct. It could climb to 30,000 feet, dive at 400 miles per hour, and still skim the treetops without losing control. It could outrun, outclimb, and outfight nearly everything the Luftwaffe had left. To Howard, that meant freedom, the ability to fight the war his way. Most pilots flew in disciplined formation, maintaining distance, preserving altitude. He didn't. He slipped the leash whenever opportunity appeared, chasing shadows across the countryside. His squadron leaders called him unpredictable, though the mechanics who serviced his plane called him something else. The farm boy who won't quit. He took the war personally. When bombers came home riddled with holes or half their crews gone, Howard's anger burned. He'd seen friends vanish into fireballs. He'd flown through flak so thick it sounded like gravel on a tin roof. He no longer cared for textbook tactics. He cared about results. That attitude began to spread. As the Allies advanced, airfields followed. Makeshift strips carved from frozen ground in Belgium and France. From these, the Mustangs launched dawn to dusk, attacking trains, trucks, and convoys. Their pilots lived in tents, flew 3 missions a day, and learned to trust nothing but reflex. Every second in the sky demanded decision. Every decision carried a cost. In that crucible, the rule book shrank to a single page. See it. Hit it. Live. By the winter of 1945, Howard had already scored multiple victories. But to him, the war wasn't about tallies. It was about clearing the skies once and for all. Burning the Luftwaffe out of existence. In late February, reconnaissance reports showed clusters of German fighters regrouping on remote airfields near Bonn and the Rhine. Weather grounded most Allied sorties. The missions were postponed. Howard stared at those photographs for hours. Lines of planes, parked and vulnerable. To a commander, it was intelligence. To him, it was a challenge. The next morning, he walked to his Mustang before dawn. The frost still clung to the wings. He checked his guns, filled his auxiliary tanks, and told the crew chief he was just going for a sweep. But his route didn't follow any approved flight plan. He wasn't joining a formation. He wasn't waiting for orders. He was going hunting. Alone. That single decision would ignite one of the most devastating solo strikes of the entire air war. And it would prove a truth commanders had tried to suppress since the first dogfight over Europe. Sometimes, the line between madness and brilliance is drawn by survival itself. To understand what the farm boy did that winter morning, you have to understand what low-level strafing really meant. It wasn't glory. It was suicide wrapped in steel and noise. At 400 miles an hour, the ground isn't a surface. It's a weapon. The smallest misjudgment, the slightest dip of a wing, means death. The trees blur, the horizon vanishes, and every sense collapses into reaction. In those seconds, the pilot isn't thinking. He's surviving. That's what made men like Howard different. He thrived there. The P-51 Mustang wasn't designed for strafing, but it turned out to be perfect for it. Its Merlin engine, a British design built in American factories, gave it unmatched power at any altitude. At 12,000 feet, it could outclimb a German fighter. At 200 feet, it could turn the sky into a straight razor. Its 650 caliber Browning machine guns, synchronized in perfect alignment, could fire nearly 1,000 rounds every 10 seconds. Each bullet traveled faster than sound, leaving a line of glowing tracers that stitched across the target like a welder's flame. A good pilot didn't need to aim long. One burst across a fuel tank, one hit on a wing root, and the target was gone. But at that speed and altitude, there was no time for second chances. Strafing wasn't flying. It was geometry under pressure. You approached the field low to avoid radar. You kept the sun behind you, the terrain between you and the flak guns. You never stayed over the target for more than 10 seconds. If you did, you were already dead. Most commanders forbade solo strafing runs for that reason. The losses were catastrophic. The German fields were ringed with 20mm and 37mm flak guns, weapons that could shred an aircraft with one hit. Even light machine guns, firing from barns or tree lines, could tear open a Mustang's radiator or snap its control lines. Howard knew all of that, but he also understood something the manuals never captured. That surprise could be deadlier than flak. When you attacked alone, you didn't give the enemy time to react. There was no sound of approaching engines, no formation roar to warn them. One moment the field was silent. The next, it was on fire, and Howard's flying style made that surprise surgical. He never came in level. He attacked from a shallow diagonal, rolling as he fired. forcing gunners to track a target that was constantly shifting angle and altitude. Each pass was unique, unpredictable. Where most pilots would climb and circle, he'd roll under and come in from a different vector, using the terrain like a shield. It wasn't just reckless, it was revolutionary. The Allies had spent most of the war learning to think strategically. But Howard and pilots like him fought tactically, in seconds, not plans. Every decision came down to a handful of variables: airspeed, angle, burst length, escape vector. They made those calculations instinctively, guided by experience more than theory. There was also the aircraft's durability. The P-51 could take punishment. Its self-sealing fuel tanks could survive small arms fire. Its laminar flow wing kept lift stable even at low speeds. Where other planes stalled or lost control near the ground, the Mustang could glide like a predator, smooth, steady, lethal. Howard knew exactly how far he could push it. He'd tested the limits over Belgium and France, skimming trees so low that leaves stuck in his radiator grill. He'd learned how the Mustang sounded right before it stalled, that faint change in engine note, that shudder in the control stick. He'd learned it the same way a farmer learns the feel of a plow, through work, through repetition, through scars. That mastery made him dangerous. While others feared the ground, Howard used it. He treated the landscape as camouflage, diving along rivers and roads to mask his approach. He'd pop over a ridge, drop into a field, and fire before anyone realized he was there. By the time the smoke rose, he was gone. In military terms, that's called initiative. In human terms, it's called instinct refined by desperation. By early 1945, that instinct had become a weapon more effective than any radar or bomb sight. Howard's kind of flying couldn't be taught in a classroom. It couldn't even be fully explained. It had to be felt. That was what commanders didn't understand, and what the Germans feared most. They could fight doctrine. They couldn't fight chaos. In the final months of the war, as German pilots dwindled and Allied control grew absolute, it wasn't the bombers that broke the Luftwaffe. It was men like Howard, diving out of nowhere, tearing through airfields like avenging ghosts. They made the ground itself unsafe. And soon, Howard would show just how devastating that kind of warfare could be, when he turned a simple patrol into the deadliest solo attack of the entire European air campaign. In every war, there are two kinds of courage: the trained kind and the born kind. By 1945, the skies over Europe belonged mostly to the second. The U.S. Army Air Forces had entered the war with the dream of perfect control. Formations, doctrines, procedures designed to turn chaos into discipline. But no plan ever survived the first burst of flak. At 25,000 feet, control meant nothing. Instinct meant everything. For men like Lieutenant Jack Howard, instinct wasn't just a survival tool. It was identity. He wasn't built for the academy or the classroom. He was built for work, the kind that started before sunrise and didn't end until the fields were done. He'd grown up in the Pacific Northwest, where weather changed without warning, and men learned to trust their gut or get hurt. That same intuition followed him into the cockpit. To some commanders, that made him dangerous. To those who flew beside him, it made him invincible. Howard never claimed to be brave. He admitted later that he was afraid before every takeoff, afraid of the dark shapes that waited above the clouds, afraid of the explosions that bloomed without warning. But he also understood that fear was fuel. It sharpened his reflexes, tightened his grip, made his senses electric. Flying a Mustang was sensory overload. The vibration of the Merlin engine traveled up through the seat into his spine. The cockpit smelled of gun oil, gasoline, and cold metal. Every instrument trembled slightly: altimeter, airspeed, fuel pressure, all alive, all demanding attention. He flew by feel more than sight. The slightest change in engine tone told him what the gauges didn't, and when he entered combat, the noise fell away. Pilots often described it later, the strange silence in the middle of chaos, the world narrowing to a single task, the guns firing, the tracers rising, but inside the cockpit, there was only calm. That calm was what separated men like Howard from the rest. Others froze, overwhelmed by too many variables. He reacted. He said little over the radio, kept his formation loose, and trusted his instincts to lead him home. But there was a darker side to that instinct. Fighter pilots were young, most barely 20. They lived on adrenaline, cigarettes, and luck. Each mission could be their last, and they knew it. That knowledge did strange things to men. Some became fatalists, convinced they were already dead. Others sought control through aggression, through action. They couldn't stop the war, but they could dominate one small piece of it, the patch of sky in front of them. Howard fell into the second group. He flew low, not because it was smart, but because it felt alive. The closer he came to the ground, the more the world made sense. There were no strategies down there, no hierarchy, just speed, gravity, and aim. Psychologists later called it combat flow, a state where fear and instinct merge into perfect concentration. The rest of the world disappears. Time stretches and contracts. Every motion feels inevitable. It's what let men like Howard fly through storms of flak and still find their mark. It's also what made them restless on the ground. Between missions, fighter bases were quiet in a way that unnerved them. Pilots drank hard, played cards, fixed engines they didn't need to fix. Anything to fill the silence. Some joked loudly. Others sat alone, staring at the dirt. They lived minute to minute, never planning more than one flight ahead. Howard's crew chief once said he could always tell when a pilot's luck was about to run out. Not by the damage on his plane, but by the way he looked at it. Some men stopped caring. Others started checking every rivet, as if trying to bargain with fate. Howard wasn't like that. He treated his plane the way he treated the plow back home, as something that answered to skill, not luck. But even skill has limits. The war had reached the point where experience itself was becoming rare. Every month, new pilots arrived from the States with barely 100 hours of flight time. They didn't know what combat felt like. Howard did, too well. He knew that victory wasn't about outsmarting the enemy anymore. It was about outlasting him. That mindset, a mixture of fatalism and focus, was what pushed him beyond the edge of reason. It was why he broke formation that February morning, why he ignored radio calls, why he looked down at that frozen German airfield and saw not risk, but opportunity. He wasn't chasing glory. He was chasing control, the last kind left to a man who lived every day at the edge of death. And in that moment, as he rolled his P-51 into a dive that no manual would ever recommend, instinct finally overpowered obedience. The farm boy was no longer a soldier following orders. He was a hunter following instinct. And what happened next would etch his name into the history of the air war, not as the best pilot or the most decorated, but as the one who dared to make the impossible. Personal. February 21st. Seats, 19WWII. 9/1845. The morning broke gray and windless over the Rhine. Snow still clung to the ditches beside the airfield at Saint-Tron, Belgium, one of the forward operating strips used by the 354th Fighter Group. Pilots filed out of the ready hut for another mission. The war felt nearly over, but the danger hadn't faded. The Germans were desperate now, striking wherever they could. Rumors spread that Luftwaffe fighters were massing on fields east of Bonn, planes that could still tear into Allied bombers if given the chance. The briefing was simple. Escort, engage only if attacked, and return with enough fuel to make it back to England by nightfall. But Lieutenant Jack Howard listened with half his mind elsewhere. He had seen reconnaissance photos of that same German airfield. Dozens of enemy fighters parked neatly in rows, almost untouched. To him, it looked less like a threat, and more like an opportunity no one had the nerve to take. 2 hours later, high above the clouds, he made his decision. At 22,000 feet, his squadron was turning west for home. Fuel gauges dipped toward empty. Radios crackled with routine chatter. The mission was done. Howard broke formation without a word. One pilot noticed and called out, "Where the hell's Howard going?" No reply. The white-nosed Mustang peeled away, dropped its nose, and vanished into the cloud layer. Inside the cockpit, the altimeter spun like a clock on fast forward. 12,000 feet, 8,000, 4,000. He broke through the mist and saw it. The frozen field, rows of camouflaged aircraft half buried in snow, smoke curling from the chimneys of the maintenance sheds. Mechanics moved in small figures along the runway. He throttled down. The hum of the Merlin engine softened into a whisper. At 1,000 feet, he armed his guns. The red safety toggles flipped up. He steadied the plane. His breathing slowed. Then he dove. The air screamed around the canopy. The horizon became a blur. He leveled out at treetop height, lining up his sight on the nearest row of planes. He pressed the trigger. The Brownings erupted, a solid, deafening roar that vibrated through the fuselage. Tracers streaked across the snow, ripping through the first Messerschmitt. The fuel tank ignited. In seconds, flames leapt from wing to wing. Mechanics scattered, tripping over refueling hoses as explosions tore across the field. Howard banked left, climbing barely 50 feet above the trees, then rolled and came in again. A second pass. This time he aimed for the hangars. He fired in short, controlled bursts. Wooden walls splintered, then vanished in fire as fuel drums went up in a chain reaction. Black smoke twisted skyward. He could feel the shock waves hammer through his Mustang's wings. Alarms flickered. But he stayed in the dive, weaving through debris and shrapnel, firing at every aircraft that moved, parked, taxiing, or burning. Every pass carried death. By the fourth run, the Germans had recovered enough to fight back. Flak guns opened up from the tree line, their 20mm shells bursting in bright orange puffs. One fragment tore a hole in his left wing. Another hit the tailplane, but the Mustang held. Howard dropped to less than 100 feet below the arc of the guns and fired straight across the runway. A pair of Focke-Wulfs exploded nose first. One tried to take off and never left the ground. He pulled up sharply, the G-forces crushing him into the seat. He barely cleared the treetops before banking back for one final run. Fuel was running low. Ammunition was almost gone. But the instinct that had brought him here refused to stop now. He lined up on a line of fuel trucks and opened fire. The first truck detonated in a blinding flash. The second followed, then a third. The explosion rolled across the airfield, engulfing the remaining planes. The entire horizon became a wall of flame. Howard's Mustang shuddered violently from the blast wave. The canopy rattled. Warning lights glowed red. But he didn't climb until he was certain there was nothing left moving below. Then, finally, he pulled up. The airfield behind him was gone. Nothing but burning wreckage and smoke curling toward the clouds. 30 aircraft destroyed, dozens more crippled. It had taken 15 minutes. He turned west toward Allied lines, alone in the gray sky, engine coughing, fuel needle on empty. His hands were raw from the vibrations, his heart still steady. The radio crackled, his squadron leader's voice, sharp and furious. "Howard, where the hell are you?" He keyed the mic and said the only words he would ever use to explain what he'd done. Had to clean up a little mess. He landed at Saint-Trond on fumes, the Mustang riddled with bullet holes, paint scorched, flaps half torn away. Ground crews ran to meet him, staring at the wreck. One asked, "Did you hit something?" Howard just pointed west and said quietly, "Yeah, an airfield." When Lieutenant Jack Howard's P-51 rolled to a stop on the muddy strip at Saint-Tron, no one spoke for several seconds. The ground crew simply stared. The Mustang looked like it had flown through hell. Wings torn open, rudder stitched with flak holes, oil leaking down the fuselage like blood. One tire was half shredded, the canopy cracked, the fuselage spattered with soot and fire marks. Howard cut the engine, and silence fell. Only the faint ticking of cooling metal filled the air. A mechanic climbed onto the wing and looked inside. "You shouldn't be alive," he muttered. Howard just nodded. He unstrapped, pulled the film canister from the gun camera, and handed it over. "Get this to intelligence," he said, voice even. Hours later, inside the operations hut, officers crowded around a flickering projector. The gun camera film played in black and white, each frame a burst of chaos. The first pass showed explosions leaping across the runway. The second revealed hangars disintegrating. The third, burning fuel trucks, men scattering. By the fourth, the entire airfield was engulfed in smoke. When the footage ended, the room stayed silent. 30 aircraft confirmed destroyed. At least 10 more heavily damaged. The entire Luftwaffe dispersal site wiped off the map. By one pilot, in 15 minutes, without orders. Technically, it was an act of insubordination. Strategically, it was a masterpiece. The report climbed the chain of command within hours. At group headquarters, the reaction was disbelief mixed with discomfort. No mission order had sanctioned the attack. No authorization existed for solo strikes deep into enemy territory. But the results were undeniable. Howard's squadron commander, torn between pride and protocol, filed the event as unauthorized action producing exceptional results. It was military language for "we can't punish success." Within days, the gun camera footage reached the desks of the 8th Air Force senior staff in England. Analysts replayed it again and again, mapping each pass, calculating angles, burst durations, escape vectors. The data revealed a precision that bordered on surgical. Every burst struck a vital point: engines, fuel tanks, ammunition dumps. Howard hadn't simply attacked. He had dissected an airfield. General Jimmy Doolittle, the legendary commander of the 8th Air Force, saw the footage personally. His comment was brief: "Keep him flying. Just tell him not to do it twice." The contradiction was clear. The Army Air Forces could not officially reward defiance, but they could not ignore it either. In private, officers debated whether Howard's attack was bravery or recklessness, or whether, in war, the two were even different. Psychologists who interviewed fighter pilots later found that those with the highest success rates often shared one trait: a willingness to act before thinking. Howard embodied that perfectly. He'd bypassed fear, skipped hesitation, and turned instinct into action. The purest form of combat initiative. Among pilots, word spread quickly. Men gathered in mess halls to watch his gun camera film, frame by frame. They memorized the timing of his dives, the tightness of his rolls, the way he stayed low enough to avoid flak, yet precise enough to destroy targets in sequence. Before long, a phrase entered squadron slang: "pulling a Howard." It meant ignoring protocol, trusting instinct, and making the impossible look deliberate. Commanders discouraged the expression. They knew that too many Howards could wreck discipline. But secretly, they admired the audacity. For the men who risked their lives daily, it wasn't rebellion, it was survival. A month later, the Allied advance reached the ruins of that German airfield. Reconnaissance confirmed every claim: burnt-out fuselages, melted hangars, and blackened craters where fuel depots once stood. No aircraft had escaped. The Luftwaffe's regional commander reportedly told interrogators, "We lost an entire wing in 1 hour. We thought it was a full attack group. It wasn't. It was one man." When the intelligence reports returned to Allied command, the conclusions were startling. Howard's mission had crippled local air defenses, delayed sorties against Allied bombers, and cleared a key corridor for the final push across the Rhine. A single act of defiance had accelerated the destruction of German air power. Howard received the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions, though the citation avoided specifics. Officially, it read, "For extraordinary heroism and disregard for personal safety during combat operations over enemy territory." Unofficially, every pilot knew what it meant. He had done what every man dreamed of doing: fought the war not as a cog in a machine, but as a master of his own sky. In the weeks that followed, Howard continued flying, still fearless, still disobedient in small ways. But those who knew him said something had changed. He talked less. He stared longer at the horizon after missions. He had seen too much, fire for one lifetime. And when his luck finally ran out a few weeks later, when flak tore through his engine over Bavaria and sent him parachuting into captivity, no one was surprised. They said it was inevitable. He'd flown too close to the edge too many times. But by then, his legend was sealed. To his comrades, he wasn't just a pilot. He was proof that sometimes the difference between chaos and genius is nothing more than a heartbeat and the will to act on it. By March 1945, the skies above Europe no longer belonged to the Reich. They belonged to the Americans, to the men who had turned the science of flying into a language of aggression. The Luftwaffe still existed on paper, but in practice it was dying in fragments. Its aces were dead or grounded, its fuel reserves nearly gone, its factories burning. The last pilots Germany sent into combat were boys, barely trained, often flying without radios, guided only by instinct and desperation. Meanwhile, the Allies had turned the sky into a weapon that never slept. From sunrise to dusk, the hum of P-51s, P-47s, and Typhoons filled the air over Germany. They hunted trains, convoys, and whatever dared to move. The bombers still leveled cities by the hundreds, but it was the fighter bombers that truly broke the spine of German resistance. Every airfield that burned, every train that exploded under strafing fire, was a small step toward ending the war. And it was done by pilots who fought like Howard. The military called it initiative. The men themselves called it survival. Commanders studied Howard's mission carefully. His attack had not been an isolated success. It was the embodiment of a shift already taking shape. Pilots who once waited for orders were now expected to decide, to act, to exploit targets of opportunity without hesitation. Discipline still mattered, but initiative had become sacred. This wasn't bravado. It was evolution. The speed of modern air war had outgrown the chain of command. By the time an order traveled from headquarters to the cockpit, the moment had already passed. Men like Howard proved that victory required minds capable of matching that speed. Minds that could analyze, react, and strike in seconds. Within weeks, the U.S. Army Air Forces formally expanded their definition of authorized targets. Fighter groups were encouraged to destroy anything that supported German logistics: aircraft, vehicles, even horse-drawn wagons. For the first time, the official doctrine embraced what individual pilots had already discovered through experience: that chaos, when guided by instinct, could be precision. The results were brutal and effective. Between February and May 1945, Allied fighter groups destroyed over 4,000 enemy aircraft on the ground, most through low-level attacks modeled after what Howard had done that day. Entire Luftwaffe squadrons ceased to exist before they ever left the runway. On the ground, German morale broke completely. Civilians no longer looked up expecting salvation. They looked up expecting annihilation. Captured German pilots would later describe a feeling of constant exposure, the sense that nowhere, not even their own airfields, was safe anymore. Howard's kind of flying, wild, instinctive, self-directed, had done more than destroy machines. It had destroyed confidence, and that mattered more than numbers. In those final weeks, the Allies didn't just own the sky. They owned the rhythm of the war. They could strike, refuel, strike again, while the enemy stumbled, blind and disoriented. It was the difference between planning a fight and living one. When historians looked back, they realized the shift was philosophical as much as tactical. The United States had entered the war believing in control, in hierarchy, in coordination, in following procedure. It ended the war believing in trust. Trust in the pilot. Trust in the man who could make decisions in the cockpit faster than any general could on the ground. That trust had been born from disobedience. Howard had not meant to start a revolution in doctrine. He had simply done what every instinct in his body demanded. But when his attack succeeded, it validated something commanders could no longer deny. Sometimes, the best soldier is the one who ignores the rules at the right moment. And in the wreckage of those German airfields, among the charred shells of fighters that never left the ground, that truth became impossible to forget. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the world exhaled, but the men who had fought in the sky never really landed. For them, the war had not been about medals or orders. It had been about instinct, survival, and split-second choices that no doctrine could predict. The lessons of pilots like Jack Howard didn't fade with peace. They became the foundation of a new kind of warfare, one built on speed, independence, and the human mind's ability to process chaos. The U.S. Army Air Forces, soon to become the United States Air Force, began compiling thousands of combat reports to study what had worked and why. Again and again, the same pattern appeared. The pilots who succeeded most consistently were those who took initiative, who acted without waiting for perfect information. They trusted experience, not procedure. What had once been labeled reckless was redefined as adaptive. By the 1950s, these findings were doctrine. Instructors at Nellis Air Force Base and Maxwell Field taught young pilots a new creed: initiative under fire. It was Howard's philosophy, turned into regulation. Never wait for orders when the opportunity is clear, read one training manual. The enemy will not wait for you. And the lesson went far beyond America. The Soviet Union studied captured Allied records and came to the same conclusion. Victory in the jet age would belong to the pilot who could think faster than his instruments. It wasn't technology that won wars anymore. It was the speed of human decision. That was the legacy of Howard's 15 minutes over Germany. In the Korean War, F-86 Sabre pilots carried the torch, flying solo or in pairs against superior numbers of MiG-15s and relying on the same intuition that had guided Howard. In Vietnam, that spirit reappeared in low-level strikes by F-100s and F-105s, aircraft diving through jungle valleys, where split-second instinct decided life or death. Each generation inherited not his name, but his mindset. Yet with progress came unease. Howard's mission, and others like it, had proven how effective aggression could be, but it also blurred moral lines. His strafing runs hadn't just destroyed aircraft, they'd killed ground crews, mechanics, and men trying to flee. The gun camera film that thrilled his peers also revealed the brutality of total air dominance. After the war, historians and ethicists debated it. Was such destruction necessary when Germany was already beaten? Was the courage that ended the war also the same force that made it so terrible? Howard never answered. He returned home to Oregon, started a small crop dusting business, and rarely spoke of the war. When asked by a journalist in the 1960s whether he'd been proud of what he'd done, he hesitated before replying, "I don't think about pride. I think about the ones who didn't come back." His words captured a truth that no after-action report could measure, that every act of courage carried a private cost. To the Air Force, he remained a symbol of initiative. To himself, he was just a man who had followed instinct and somehow survived it. Decades later, when the first F-16 Fighting Falcons and F-15 Eagles took flight, their pilots were trained in energy maneuverability, a theory developed by Colonel John Boyd, who preached that adaptability and speed of thought were the essence of air combat. Boyd's ideas, the basis of modern aerial tactics, echoed the same philosophy Howard had proven with his dive in 1945. That agility of the mind mattered more than the machine itself. But beneath the science, the paradox remained. Howard's story asked the question every soldier must face: where does obedience end and responsibility begin? He had broken the rules to win, and in doing so, created new ones. History praised him for it, yet his own conscience stayed silent. In museums, his gun camera footage still loops in grainy black and white, bursts of fire across a frozen airfield, the visible proof of one man's will. Viewers watch in awe, but few notice the hesitation in the last few seconds. When the camera shakes, the guns fall silent, and for a brief instant, the pilot's shadow crosses the burning ground. That's all that remains of him now, a blur of motion and defiance. A reminder that even in victory, war never forgets who dared to decide. History often remembers the noise, the roar of engines, the thunder of guns, the triumph of destruction. But when it comes to men like Jack Howard, it's the silence afterward that tells the real story. He didn't fight for glory, or medals, or headlines. He fought because something inside him refused to stand still while others died. Because instinct, raw, unrefined, dangerous, can sometimes see what orders cannot. That's what made his story both inspiring and unsettling. Howard's 15 minutes of defiance became a symbol of victory. Yet beneath that victory lay a truth as old as war itself, that courage and chaos are bound by a single heartbeat. One misjudged second, and genius becomes madness. One act of rebellion, and the line between hero and outlaw disappears. He survived his dive into fire. Many others did not. But in surviving, he left behind a question that no general has ever truly answered. Do we win wars because of rules, or in spite of them? His attack didn't change the course of the war alone, but it changed the way men thought about it, how they viewed risk, initiative, and responsibility. The manuals that once preached obedience now teach adaptability. The pilots who once followed orders now learn to trust their instincts. And every time a fighter jet streaks across the sky, its pilot carries a piece of Howard's recklessness in the wiring of their training. He died quietly years later, far from the war, his name fading from public memory. But to those who study the history of air combat, he remains an unspoken presence. The man who broke the rules and lived to prove why rules sometimes have to be broken. In the end, his story isn't about war at all. It's about the paradox of courage, how the same impulse that saves lives can also haunt the one who acts on it. Because true bravery isn't the absence of fear or obedience, it's the decision to act when every part of you knows you shouldn't. And in that frozen sky over Germany, Jack Howard made that decision and changed the meaning of courage forever.